May takes the axe to Cameron's old guard in the most brutal reshuffle in years. Day one proper in the job, with a spring in her step and with breathtaking speed, out go Gove, Whittingdale and Morgan, and fast-tracked up the ladder Truss, Greening and even May's short-lived opponent, Andrea Leadsom. The new PM wasted no time in consigning the Cameron era to history, so what do her choices tell us about where she's heading?
Mr Johnson, you're going to stop and have a word?
What about those?
It could be into choppy waters with Boris. Foreign reaction to the new Foreign Secretary, less than enthusiastic.
It is inevitable that there's going to be a certain amount of plaster coming off the ceiling in the chancelleries of Europe. It wasn't the result that they were expecting.
In other news tonight, Assad sees no reason for an apology after 5 years of Syria's deadly war. And running up that hill, why Froome's on foot in the Tour de France.
This is ITV News at 10 with Julie Etchingham.
Good evening. It wasn't so much a reshuffle as a mini-revolution. Theresa May herself called it bold, but few were quite prepared on a summer's morning for the political carnage unleashed from Number 10. Not for her, any gradual transition from Cameron's era. It had started last night with a complete clear-out in the top jobs and continued at high speed today. Out went Gove, Morgan, Villiers, Crabb, Whittingdale, Letwin, either sacked or resigned. In from the start came the team she wanted around her, the likes of Justine Greening, Liz Truss and even Andrea Leadsom. The prominent survivor was also a bit of a surprise, Jeremy Hunt, who stays on as Health Secretary.
The name was correct, so too was the address. And at times today, the bouquets of flowers for Theresa May of 10 Downing Street were arriving at a faster rate than the politicians she was hiring and firing. But Mrs May wasn't there to receive the earliest bunches. Such is the ruthless speed of change in Westminster. The Prime Minister isn't yet able to sleep at this address. But given her workload at the moment, sleep is something she doesn't have much time for. Mrs May's new appointments included Justine Greening as Education Secretary. Ms Greening is also in charge of the Equalities Brief and called it her perfect job. A job too for her recent rival Andrea Leadsom, who enters the cabinet as Environment Minister. The Leave campaigner has to work out how farmers and fishermen can still get the subsidies outside the EU. Another Brexit champion is Chris Grayling. He gets transport and with it tricky things like Heathrow expansion and the HS2 high-speed train line. And then there is Jeremy Hunt. Junior doctors might wish to look away now as he is back as Health Secretary. There was speculation he'd be moved when he arrived without his NHS badge on his lapel, but when he emerged from Number 10, he nodded to the cameras when asked if he was still Health Secretary.
Sorry, I've just got to squeeze through.
And that NHS badge was firmly pinned back in place.
Did the Prime Minister ask you to take a different approach to the junior doctors?
It would appear the same approach, the imposition of the new junior doctors contract, is what he has planned. But Theresa May had no plans for Michael Gove. He was sacked not long after his cornflakes this morning.
Very nice to see you. Very nice to see you.
The price perhaps for the disloyalty he showed Boris Johnson over the leadership. It showed the Prime Minister had concluded he could not be trusted. Another career over as a result of the EU referendum. So apart from Michael Gove, who else was sacked or shuffled out? Nicky Morgan, the Education Secretary who'd supported Mr Gove for leader, was axed. Stephen Crabb, so recently a leadership contender, resigned for family reasons. And John Whittingdale was removed from his job as Culture Secretary. There were apparently cheers at the BBC when it was announced. In a sign of her ambitions to help blue-collar workers, the Prime Minister promoted former coal miner Patrick McLaughlin to Conservative Party chairman, and he acknowledged that a reshuffle is, for some colleagues, a brutal business.
Politics is always, look, the politics is tough when people who've done jobs have to lose those jobs or get those jobs changed. That's part of politics, and they will know.
And so ends Theresa May's first full day as Prime Minister. There is one more woman in her cabinet than David Cameron's, and having sorted her top team tomorrow, she flies to Scotland for that other pressing issue, the future of the United Kingdom. Chris Ship, News at 10, Downing Street.
So what difference will Mrs May's cabinet clear-out make to Britain's politics, both in terms of substance, style and tone? Well, comparing the makeup of Mrs May's cabinet to that of her predecessors, there are some similarities. The average age of the cabinet is now 52. That's 1 year older than Cameron's. 8 of the 23 are women, just 1 more than last time. But one of the significant shifts is in where they were educated. Less than half, just 10, attended either Oxford or Cambridge, compared to 14 before. And there are far more who are educated at state schools. Well, our political editor, Robert Peston's here to analyse the extraordinary events of the day. Amazing scenes in Downing Street, really, just in the last 24 hours alone. How do we match the cabinet to Theresa May's avowed ambitions?
Well, she talks about having a government that serves everybody, not just the privileged few. And certainly the makeup of the cabinet, fewer people from fee-paying schools, fewer people from Oxbridge, looks a bit more like the country at large. But, and this is quite interesting, the political makeup of the cabinet is definitely more right-wing than it was under Cameron, and yet her rhetoric is much more left-wing. How does she square that? Well, partly it's because I think she will be a very dominating Prime Minister. I think she will be instructing ministers possibly more often than Cameron, but also in a couple of the very important socially oriented posts, education, work and pensions, more left-wing ministers, Justine Greening and Damien Green, much more on the left of the party. So I think she stands a reasonable chance of fulfilling her ambitions to take the party in a slightly more socially inclusive direction, but I suspect there'll be a lot of arguments along the way. Now, one of the clearest messages that came out of that speech in Downing Street yesterday was her utter commitment to the preservation of the United Kingdom. Yeah. She's off to Scotland. It sets out a clear territory, really, a bit of importance here. Yes, I mean, she is this is sort of symbolising her commitment to the Union by going up there. I suspect it'll be a pretty tense day. Nicola Sturgeon, absolutely clear she wants Scotland to remain within the European Union, whatever the rest of the UK does, and the rest of the UK is plainly set on a trajectory to leave. Impossible for me to see how the new Prime Minister can deliver that to Nicola Sturgeon, other than by allowing Nicola Sturgeon to have a referendum on leaving the United Kingdom, excuse me. Absolutely no possibility of Theresa May underwriting that. Absolutely none. It'll be fascinating to see how that relationship develops, won't it? Robert, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Well, if the pace of change has been bewildering here, that's nothing to the reaction from overseas to the government's changes. Inevitably, much of it has been focused on the appointment of Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary. Earlier, the French Foreign Minister called him a liar. And tonight, Mr Johnson was booed after making a speech at the French embassy.
Johnson, what would you say to those who are unhappy about you being Foreign Secretary?
For someone with a rather chaotic reputation, it wasn't the best start. The new Foreign Secretary totally confused as to the whereabouts of his new ministerial car. Sir. If he's taking a while to get used to the new reality, the same could be said for the rest of the world.
I'm so sorry.
Of all Theresa May's appointments, Boris Johnson's the one that's made global headlines, provoking surprise in Russia
Boris Johnson
and France,
Boris Johnson, partisan du Brexit,
and sniggers in Germany.
Thematik. Was kann denn die Bundesregierung von Boris Johnson?
And just watch the reaction of the US State Department spokesman as he hears the news.
Foreign Secretary has just been announced as Boris Johnson. How do you think this will affect?
Smile swiftly removed, he remembers to be diplomatic.
Well, look, I mean, we're always going to be able to work with the British, no matter who is occupying the role of Foreign Secretary.
The Germans were much less so.
Es ist bitter für Großbritannien.
Their foreign minister laying into irresponsible politicians who encourage Brexit and run off to play cricket. As for the French, they just call him a liar with his back against the wall. So what does the Foreign Secretary think of his global welcome?
It is inevitable that there's going to be a certain amount of plaster coming off the ceiling in the chancelleries of Europe. It wasn't the result that they were expecting, and clearly they're making their views known in a frank and free way.
If Boris Johnson's challenge in his new job inside here is showing the world he is now a serious player, Theresa May has certainly shown she's serious about Brexit, because there is now a band of committed Brexiteers in the 3 key roles which will establish our new place in the world. Liam Fox in the new Department of International Trade and David Davis in charge of Brexit will have to work closely with the new Foreign Secretary. Some of those who know him well say only fools would discount his skills.
In the 8 years that Boris was mayor, he spent a lot of time travelling overseas, drumming up inward investment for London and by extension the rest of the UK. So this is something he's used to doing, and he's got a proven track record of delivery.
Despite his French,
to coin a phrase, toujours plus étroite.
At an event at the French embassy tonight, Mr. Johnson was jeered. The new Foreign Secretary needs to cultivate some international friends, and fast. Romilly Weeks, News at 10.
Well, the notice could barely have been shorter for Philip Hammond to receive one of the toughest briefs in present-day politics as the new Chancellor. But if looks are anything to go by, he appeared pretty unruffled by what's landed on his plate and utterly undaunted in calmly tearing up George Osborne's austerity agenda. Among the first things he did was ditch Mr Osborne's plan for a post-Brexit emergency budget.
The new Chancellor started early today, quickly ruling out the idea of an emergency budget.
No, the Prime Minister made clear we'll do an autumn statement in the usual way, in the autumn, and we'll look carefully over the summer at the situation.
On his way to the Treasury, he took time to outline his general approach, which sounds a lot more relaxed about borrowing than his predecessor.
As a matter of economic principle, are you prepared to borrow to invest?
Look, borrowing when the cost of money is cheap has some great attractions, but this country is already highly indebted, and we need to be very careful about the signals we send to markets about our intentions. So it's about getting the balance right.
That doesn't sound like a no.
Making sure that we borrow and invest wisely where we can make big impacts on Britain's productivity and thus get a return on that investment.
Then to the Treasury for a meeting with the Bank of England governor. The bank kept interest rates on hold today, but could yet lower them. And it's that cheap money which is tempting the Chancellor to borrow. Funnily enough, others would do that too.
It's Labour policy because we need long-term stable investment in our infrastructure and in skills to get our economy growing again. But I don't believe a word of it. I just don't believe a word of it. I heard this all before. George Osborne said he was going to invest in our infrastructure, and the investment pipeline they set up barely delivered.
There are other issues for the new Chancellor too. Reducing the deficit is still a priority, albeit less of one. He's committed to building the new Hinkley Point nuclear plant, but has yet to make up his mind on a third runway at Heathrow, and has so far refused to commit to George Osborne's pledge to cut corporation tax to 15%. Economists say the new Chancellor has little option but to relax Osborne's fiscal rules.
Mr Osborne previously was committed to eliminating the deficit entirely, no borrowing, and to do so by 2019-20. Now that was unlikely to be achieved in the face of the UK's decision to leave the European Union. So the interesting question for the Chancellor is, well, if you're prepared to borrow a bit more throughout this Parliament, does the new Chancellor want to get to balance in the next Parliament or not?
Because, as the famous note left by a departing Labour Treasury Minister said, I'm afraid there is no money.
Has anyone left you a note in a drawer to say how much money is left?
I haven't looked in the desk yet, but of course the irony is that famous note written by Liam Byrne was intended for me, who he had assumed would be the Chief Secretary to the Treasury.
He has a bigger job now, but there is still not enough money. And how Mr Hammond approaches that problem from his new office will determine how much more austerity the country faces. Carl Dinnan, News at 10, Westminster.
Well, the Bank of England's decision not to cut interest rates today was unexpected by many in the city, but keeping them on hold may not last. Well, our economics editor, Norina Hertz, is here to explain. It's a pretty big surprise, Norina.
It is true. Most economists did expect that we would see a cut in the interest rates. But actually, it wasn't that surprising that that isn't what the bank decided to do today. I'm saying this for two reasons primarily. First, the markets have been really jittery over the past few weeks. So by doing nothing, essentially the bank's signalling there isn't some immediate danger, and it's a move to calm the markets. The second reason is that the bank is keen to get more data, more hard evidence before it decides by how much to cut interest rates, because this really is a case of they are going to cut interest rates, but it's a case of by how much. But to understand this, it's really important to put it in some sort of context. Before the financial crisis, what we saw was that interest rates hovered at between 4 and 6%. But when the crisis hit, the Bank of England slashed interest rates from 4.5% to 0.5%, and they've basically flatlined at that level for the past 7 years. So when we're talking about a cut in interest rates, the bank's really got very little room to manoeuvre, which raises the question, of course, of how effective can a cut in interest rates really be?
So what other levers can they pull in this scenario?
Well, the Bank of England does have a toolkit, but there aren't that many tools left. Things that they could do, they could restart quantitative easing, pump more money into the economy. They could expand the funding for lending scheme, which is about helping businesses, small businesses, medium-sized businesses, borrow more. And it's probable that they will use these sorts of tools. In fact, my sources tell me that we can expect when the bank meets in 3 weeks' time and comes up with its next decision, what we can expect then is that we'll see both a cut in interest rates and also the deployment of some of these more unconventional tools.
Potentially busy summer ahead. Norina, thank you very much indeed for that. Thank you. A world away now, and despite all the bombings, all the lives lost, all the horror and agony in his country, President Assad of Syria has said today that he sees no reason to apologise or to shed any tears. Today, a shipment of aid finally managed to make its way through to a suburb of the besieged city of Homs, the first aid to reach there in a month. The conflict in Syria, of course, began 5 years ago when an anti-government uprising spread across the country and descended into civil war around a year later. So far, 400,000 people are estimated to have died, and 11.5 million refugees have fled the fighting. President Assad was speaking to Bill Neely from our colleagues in the American network, NBC.
He's not just a defiant survivor. President Assad is confident now. He told me Russia's help was critical, American airstrikes ineffective, victory could come in months. As with everything he says and does, it needs to be challenged. So I did.
How long do you think this will take you to win this war?
You're talking about something that's related to many factors. The most important factor is how long are the supporters of those terrorists are going to keep supporting them, especially Turkey and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, with the endorsement of some Western countries, including the United States. If you don't have that support, it won't take more than a few months.
Realistically, this will take years, won't it?
If you're talking about how much it's going to take as only Syrian conflict, isolated conflict, this is where it won't take more than a few months. But if it's not isolated, as it's the case today, with the interference of many regional and international powers, it will going to take a long time.
A year ago, the war was going quite differently. You made a speech in which you said you were short of troops. You had to give up some areas reluctantly. What changed after that was that Russia entered the war. That's the real reason this war is turning, isn't it? That Russia is on your side.
Definitely, the Russian support of the Syrian army has tipped the scales against the terrorists.
It's the crucial factor.
It is definitely.
Do you welcome American airstrikes against ISIS?
And during the American illegal intervention with their allies, ISIS was expanding and the terrorism was expanding and taking over new areas in Syria. They're not serious. So I cannot say I welcome the unseriousness and to be in Syria illegal.
Thousands of missions, hundreds of airstrikes. The United States is not being serious?
The question is not how many strikes, what the achievement, that's the question. The reality is telling. The reality is telling that since the beginning of the American airstrikes, the terrorism has been expanding and prevailing.
Have you ever cried about what's happened to Syria?
Crying doesn't mean you are a good man. As a president, it's about what you're going to do, not about how you're going to feel. How are you going to protect the Syrians?
NBC's Bill Neely talking there to President Assad of Syria. Prosecutors investigating the death of 13-month-old Poppy Worthington have ruled today that there is not enough evidence to charge her father over her death. Poppy died after being found with serious injuries at her home in Cumbria in 2012. A High Court judge later ruled that her father, Paul Worthington, probably sexually assaulted her, something he has always denied. Zimbabwe is moving closer tonight to more confrontations between protesters against Robert Mugabe's regime and his security forces. A pastor who's been the voice of peaceful opposition to the regime is speaking out again after a court released him from detention yesterday. News at 10 reports tonight from inside Harare on the simmering tensions in a country where the protest movement has refused to be brutalised into submission.
In Zimbabwe, a long subdued opposition has suddenly found its voice again. And you can tell the authorities here are nervous, for there is one voice more than any they've struggled to silence.
This is what it means to be united.
Pastor Ivan still spreading the word.
And let's send this message clear to our government that enough is enough.
He is that rare phenomenon, a dissident who has defied the government and won. So power to the pastor, as late last night they hailed his victory and hoisted him aloft when a court threw out charges of subversion. And though his liberty may be short-lived, he is inspiring supporters in their thousands. This show of solidarity does not happen often in a country where the riot police are rightly feared.
It's been an extraordinary day here, and amongst this crowd, a real feeling that for now, the future of this nation is inextricably linked with the fate of just one man.
Yet the stay away from work the pastor called for today was largely ignored, despite the desperate times. The schools are still working, but everything else feels like it's falling apart, even for the 10% lucky enough to be in work.
These are some of the things that you have to buy in order to make your children survive. These are round nuts, because you know that they are nutritious. Yeah. You can't afford to buy bread. Bread here is expensive, it's $1.
How long can this go on for, do you think?
As long as our administration is not concerned about the welfare of the people, there's nothing we expect to change.
With his pay packet late and light, his wife worries how they'll get to the end of each month and the cupboards are as bare as the nation's coffers. It is brutal economics versus a brutal state. A reckoning cannot be far off. John Ray, News at 10, Harare.
Now, if ever there were a snapshot of pure competitive spirit, you'd have spotted it on a French mountainside today. The British cyclist Chris Froome, who currently holds the leader's yellow jersey in the Tour de France, was caught up in a pretty nasty accident. But he refused to be daunted and swapped 2 wheels for 2 legs.
Mont Ventoux always provides the Tour de France with drama, but nothing quite like this. Richie Porte colliding with a television motorbike, Mollema and Chris Froome piling in behind. Wearing the yellow jersey and his bike damaged, Froome set off on foot up the hill as fast as his cycling shoes would allow.
Chris Froome is running up Mont Ventoux.
A service car brought Froome another bike, but he couldn't get his feet in the pedals. Finally, his team car made it through with a replacement. In all, Chris Froome lost around a minute and a half.
Mollema, Richie and myself just went piling over the back of the motorbike, and another motorbike came into the back of me and broke my frame. So I was just left running, really.
It was an accident few would find surprising. The cyclists have frequently complained about spectators crowding onto the road.
The crowd was just all on the road in the middle. They just stopped right in front of us. We had nowhere to go. The next minute,
straight over the top of the motorbike. I think it's just a mess.
So Chris Froome has now lost a minute and a half to Bauke Mollema.
For a while it looked like Froome would lose the yellow jersey, but the race jury gave him the same time as the two riders he was with before the accident.
Because Froome today practically lose 2 minutes, so I think it's not correct from the sport side, and we decided like this.
That sentiment was not shared by all. As Froome put the yellow jersey back on, there was some booing. But from the cycling teams, calls for the tour organisers to improve crowd control. Duncan Golostani, News at 10.
The Open Golf Championship began at Royal Troon in Scotland today with the American Phil Mickelson, who won the title 3 years ago, taking a big lead with a record-equalling round of 63. But the shot of the day was undoubtedly by the South African Louis Oosthuizen, with this hole-in-one at the 14th. Though he, like mostly everyone else, finished well behind the leader Mickelson at the end of the day.
First hole-in-one.
And finally, there will always be duties David Cameron will want to fulfil, like today when he went to a memorial service for 2 policewomen in Manchester. But the fact remains that for him and the other big beasts who until yesterday ruled Britain's political jungle, life has changed, and pretty suddenly. They were at the top of their game, living on the pulse of events and shaping a country's destiny. And in a blink, it's pretty much gone. So how might they cope?
Notting Hill. It's been a while. Dave and George meet for a Thursday morning coffee. No red boxes, no big decisions. Meanwhile, at a bookshop in Kensington, Michael Gove, with a little longer to browse for a summer reading list and certainly longer to actually read it than he would have thought just 24 hours ago. One man who knows just how they might feel is their former coalition colleague Nick Clegg. A savaging at last year's election left his party in pieces, him in tears and out of the leadership. So how did he cope?
One moment you're party leader, I was Deputy Prime Minister, the next moment you're at home making your way to the supermarket. I mean, it's just, that's the way the system works. And it's very abrupt, but I have to say, it has its silver linings. You get your life back of it, you get your weekends back.
Those with passions alongside politics may find it an easier adjustment. Sir John Major famously heading to the cricket after his drubbing in '97. Others maybe struggled with letting go, like Lady Thatcher at a Conservative rally in 2001.
The mummy returns.
Those who watch our politicians in fine detail know what challenge change can bring to such big personalities.
They have their time, don't they? It's inevitable that eventually, at some time, they will have to move on. David Cameron and George Osborne were, in a sense, quite bland and didn't really give us a lot of comedy to really hook onto. I mean, they did a bit, so sometimes you don't mind them going on. But others you wish would come back. William Hague, I wish he would come back more prominently.
And some sage words of advice directly from Nick Clegg to David Cameron.
Oh, don't read the newspapers, take a long holiday, get your life back. He's obviously devoted to his family, and just enjoy it, just enjoy that.
At such young ages, there are clearly many paths these newly liberated politicos might take. Some serious, and maybe on occasions not so serious. There is always, of course, I'm a Celebrity. Straight out of one jungle and into another.
Possibly unlikely in that case, I suspect. And if we haven't had enough of political upheaval already this week, Labour's turn again tomorrow. Owen Smith is set to unveil the formal launch of his leadership challenge to Jeremy Corbyn. Mr Smith, the former Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary, has said he wants either a general election or a second EU referendum. As we heard, Theresa May is set to go to Scotland tomorrow, perhaps the biggest test yet for her Brexit. Unveil his choice for his vice-presidential running mate. It's thought to be Mike Pence, the governor of Indiana, who's seen as a unifying figure. And Tim Peake, another person who's come back down to earth lately, but in a good way, is the guest of honour at Farnborough Air Show, talking to school children who've been inspired by his amazing feats. But that's it from me and all of the News at 10 team for now. Good night.